Good evening, everyone. It's Christopher Hale here in Rutherford County in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. I'm honored to be here tonight with Jess Wilson, who is a farmer in Grundy County. I want to talk a little bit about why I had Jess on and what I hope to gain from the conversation. We know that farming is a huge integral part of our region, but also the nation as a whole, particularly in the context of a global pandemic. Farmers are the foot soldiers on the front line, feeding our families during these times. And, this has always been the American way. Farmers have always gone to work. They've always been essential workers. They've always kept the country going during times of war or famine or strife. I always remember what our founder, James Madison, the first founders of this country, the vast majority of them, almost all of them, were farmers. And James Madison said that during times of difficulty, you knew the farmer was always the first soldier of this country. And so it's a vocation that we must honor, but it's also a vocation under threat. Agriculture industry in this country and in this area faces profound threats from disease and famine, but also in virus, but also to tariffs and policy issues and climate change. And passing on the vocation of farmers to millennials and now the Zoomer generation. So I'm going to introduce Jess. Jess, can you hear me?
I can.
Good. Well, Jess, it's an honor to have you on tonight. Can you introduce a little bit about yourself, about your background, what it is you do, and the coalition you're a part of?
Sure. Thank you, Chris, for having me. My name, I'm Jess Wilson. I live in Grundy, and I am the president of the Southeast chapter, or the new chapter of the Southeast Tennessee Young Farmers Coalition. I am 43 years old, and you may be thinking that doesn't sound like a young farmer, but actually the average age of a farmer in this country is 59.4 years old, so I am still considered a young farmer. Just to give you a little background on my farm story, I grew up on a dairy farm in upstate New York, and then studied sustainable agriculture in college in Vermont. And my goal was always to be a farmer. And so I moved down here with my husband, who's from the area, and we decided we were going to start farming. But it is such a risk to get into farming. And so we didn't want to take on any personal debt. And in order to do that, we had to take this very incremental approach where we were always working other jobs or doing other things. There was always a side hustle so that we could afford to buy land and we could afford to invest in the infrastructure we needed. And so, I don't think this is an uncommon story around here. But now at 42, I've finally got into a place in my life where I have the land I need and I have the capital I need and I have the infrastructure I need to actually begin farming. So that's a kind of common story in this country. And so just my farm, personally, we do livestock mostly. We do sheep and goats, which we sell for meat. We sell them live. I also sell wool through an Etsy store. We also do organic vegetables and we do eggs. And I think that's it. Maybe I have some dairy goats, so I kind of have a little dairy operation as well. So we're a diversified family farm. We're very small. My husband works a job outside the house to support our farm. And, that's who we are. Farms are so different. There's so many different scales of farm. And there's so many different ways that people go about farming. But a lot of the folks that I work with in the Southeast region of Tennessee are in a similar boat where they're either they took this very incremental approach to get into farming and are just now able to really start growing their business, or they're looking at figuring out ways to take huge economic risk in order to move from being an aspiring farmer to being an actual farmer. And so the Tennessee Young Farmers Coalition, we're an organization, we're part of the National Young Farmers Coalition. We're a chapter. We just formed last year in July. And we our purpose is to advocate for young and beginning farmers in Southeast Tennessee.
Well, it's interesting that the phrase you just used just strikes me as, I guess, problematic. Aspiring farmer. You know what I think about as an aspiring actor in New York City. It suggests to me that there are incredible structural difficulties into getting into farming in this country, and I think about how horrible that is, because we do not exist as a country, we do not exist as a region, we do not exist as a world without agriculture and farming. Can you talk a little bit about the new difficulty that's come abroad farming, and you speak personally, but also too in a more industry context? What has COVID-19 meant for farmers in Tennessee in different variety of contexts?
Okay, let me go on to the first question about becoming a farmer, beginning farming. So the National Young Farmers Coalition did a survey in 2017, and they're upgrading their survey each year, and they have some new processes to determine their policy platform on a federal level each year. So I'm going to speak from the results of 2017, but there should be new data coming in very soon that'll kind of give us more information about what's happening. But in 2017, they surveyed young farmer members to figure out what the biggest issues were keeping them from going from student to farmer. The number one issue is land access. And I like to frame that not just land access, but access to markets. So I live in Grundy County, where land is actually affordable. But that means I'm an hour from most of my, really good markets. I'm an hour and a half from Nashville. I'm an hour from Chattanooga. So if I were to get, that poses problems. Anything closer to that, the land is really, really difficult to afford. So land access is number one. The number two issue nationally that farmers faced was student loan debt. So if just imagine, getting out of college and trying to envision your farm. Farms are there's a lot of investment that has to happen up front. So you're looking at a huge purchase of land. You're looking at, infrastructure. You're looking at capital on hand that you need. And if you're already saddled with student loan debt, that just is an impossible situation. So student loan debt is a huge issue for students moving to become farmers in this country. The third issue is labor and access to labor. And it's not just about cheap labor, because a lot of people that become farmers or have the skills needed to be farmers start out as farm workers. And so when we don't pay farm workers living wages, then how can we expect those people with the skills we need to farm to be able to move into a position of farm management or farm ownership? So there are a number of issues around labor and access to labor, but also fair labor. The fourth, did I get to four? I think the fourth biggest issue are cost of living type issues. So the first one on that list in 2017 was health insurance cost. It's a huge piece of living in a rural community. It's a huge cost. So just like student loan debt, if you have these monthly bills that you can't afford, then taking that risk to become a farmer is even harder. There are other cost of living expenses such as housing, which also comes into it, but the number one was health insurance. So that's number one question. To answer your second question about COVID, this has been a really interesting time to see what happens. Farms have been affected very differently depending on where they are in the country and their scale, and also what avenues they market through. So it's one of the very few times when I'm really grateful to be a small farmer that does direct marketing, and that means I sell directly to my customers. So, and the folks that I work with in the Young Farmers Coalition, the majority of those farms are also small, direct market farms. And so we have had a boom. There has suddenly been this interest in local food. Where can I get food? Customers are saying, where can I get food without having to go into the grocery store? Where can I get food that I know has only been touched by a few hands? And so our sales are through the roof, and that's been kind of amazing. That is not the case for all small farms. Certainly, farms that rely on wholesale outlets where they're selling to wholesale outlets and then sell to a restaurant, they're hurting because they don't have those restaurant outlets anymore. So the other thing that I've seen some is there are some small farms that are used to selling through more traditional farmers markets that have had a hard time. In our area, we have the South Cumberland Farmers Market, and we have the Rooted Here Food Hub in Suwanee. And those are organizations that I actually helped to start maybe 12 years ago, 13 years ago. And they provide an online platform for farmers to sell their goods. And because we've had that, our farmers in this area were able to just keep doing what they've always been doing and increase their sales. Some issues that we're seeing that I can relate to as a livestock farmer, because our sales have increased, we don't have access to processing, and that's been a real issue. We have a lot of farms, and we have our livestock, and we have our crops, but there are other people that we rely on, and as independent farmers, we rely on independent processors such as meat processors. There are very few independent meat processors in the state of Tennessee that are USDA certified and that we can use to then sell our meat. And so, this before COVID, it was hard to get in to a USDA processor to get your meat processed so that you could sell it. Now it's nearly impossible. There's huge wait lists. So that's been a really big issue, and that's something that our chapter of the coalition is really working on, figuring out ways that we can increase access to meat processing.
I have a question on this is, what do you think is temporary and what do you think is lasting? Can you give me some sense of what you think the lasting changes of COVID-19 will be to the agricultural industry of the state? Do you have a sense of that?
I don't know. It's very uncertain, and I don't want to even try to make predictions. I hope that the interest in local food is lasting. We certainly have new customers, and I hope that now that they're in the habit of reaching out to us as farmers and they understand where they can access food, I hope that is a lasting trend. Certainly it becomes, as people eat out more, they're not cooking at home as much. And so that's going to affect our sales some. I think that'll probably change as people go back to work. So I don't know. I don't know what will be lasting, but I really hope that the interest in local infrastructure. Part of the issue is that our competition as a small farmer, I'm competing against big farms that sell food at really cheap rates.
Sure.
And so because it's so hard to compete as a small farmer, that means my margins are tight. That means the processor that I depend on, their margins are tight. And so the reason, it's all about the market. The reason that we don't have a lot of processors is because we don't have a lot of independent farms. And so this bottleneck that we're seeing right now with not having enough processors, it's, in order to fix that, we need more people buying from local farms, but we also need to really have policy that invests in those infrastructure pieces that have been missing. So in order for us to grow as small farms, we need to be able to invest in the partner organizations like our meat processing plants.
And and I want you to answer this, if you don't mind, in both context of COVID-19, but in general, going forward. what do you need from Washington? What is the help? What are the top line issues? If I'm honored to take the oath of office on the 5th of January of 2021, what do you need from me? What do you need from your federal government to make life better for you and your family so that you can pass on this vocation to your kids?
Well, um, uh, a federal issue that I think needs to be addressed is student loan debt. That's probably the easiest policy thing that I can see being changed. So student loan debt and affordable health care. Those are two things that I think there's a lot of talk about on a federal level, where there can be change that I think would really affect small farms. Labor is a tricky issue, but let me tell you about, like, in my ideal world, and this is a little bit of fantasy, but in my ideal world, I have a farm and I can hire, and I live in this vibrant rural economy, okay, this rural community, and I can hire my neighbor and I can pay my neighbor a living wage, and I can grow food and I can sell it to my neighbors, and they can afford that food because they're paid a living wage. And that's like the ideal, and I get enough money and it all works out. But the way it actually works is that I'm competing as a small farm against farms that can have artificially low prices. And they can do that because they're huge corporations and they can own all of the value chain. They can own all the pieces, all the processing. And so they can cut costs that way. And there's some economy of scale that helps them to cut costs, but they also have lobbying power, and they can get things done in Washington and make it so they can exploit workers and they can exploit the environment, and they can therefore create an even cheaper product that I have to compete against. And so I live in a world where my product, if I want to pay myself a living wage or I want to pay a neighbor a living wage, then the price I have to pay for my product makes it unaffordable for the rest of my neighbors. So I end up selling this elitist product to rich people, which is not at all what I want. And in the meantime, the folks around me can't afford quality food because they don't have a living wage the job that they have. So just I don't know that the National Farmers Coalition has any position on wages at the moment, but the way I look at it, I feel like we all need to be brought up to a level where we can afford to eat nutritious food. And when we support a system that continually allows for the artificial low pricing of food by these giant corporations who are making a profit, it undermines all small farms.
It's remarkable. So I've been doing this for about a month now. So every night for a month, I've been doing live stream with different business leaders and elected officials and on and on and on. And you start getting to the point where you're seeing the incredible interconnectedness of all these issues. I think it's probably strange to some viewers tonight listening to a farmer talk about student loan debts, but and healthcare. But if you look at the realities, you're picking up on two realities. One is that the vast majority of farmers are quote unquote what we call self-employed. They don't exist in an employer-based system. And when we have a health insurance marketplace that is employer-based, and you have to go on your own market, you get screwed over. You get screwed over on prices, et cetera. And so you start. And what was remarkable though is our nation made a choice about 100 years ago to even longer to invest in agriculture, to say that it is so important as an industry to this country that the government is going to be involved in it. It's going to regulate it. And yes, agriculture is quote unquote too big to fail. It has to work because it feeds our families. What you seem to be suggesting, if I can say it, is that perhaps healthcare is just as important. That it is too big and too important to fail. And if it's too expensive, that is a moral issue that requires government involvement. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I would think so. Well, and I don't know if it requires government involvement. It just needs to be cheap and accessible
Sure.
to everyone. And
Sure.
you know, part of it is it's like, what kind of rural community do you want to live in? I hear politicians, they pay so much lip service to farmers. It's this great way to like talk about rural communities and let people get all nostalgic for the family farm.
You don't like our little graphics thanking farmers? You don't like that? Is that not good enough?
No, it's fine. I appreciate this, but I feel like so often we get lip service.
Sure.
But we don't get meaningful policy, and it's about creating livable rural communities. If we decide that we don't want small independent farms, we want corporate farms that work in rural areas to feed urban centers. That's super efficient. But is that the kind of community we want to live in a rural area? Do we want our neighbors to not be independent farmers who are able to make their own choices and choose their own management and things like that? Or do we want them to just be working for somebody else and not have a say in what they can do on their land?
Well, that's the moral irony that you're suggesting there, that I think I've seen time and again, is that the rural communities in this state live to feed Nashville. And that's where they get their resources. That's where they put their money in. And strangely enough, you don't get to feed your neighbors. Like the folks right around you. The subsidiarity is a big word we use, but like the local realities are missed over because what you said. They can't afford your product because you have to compete against your competitors. So you ship them up to the rich folk in Nashville, and it becomes this unvirtuous cycle again and again and again. And the end product is the rural communities get screwed over time and again. And here's what, and I thought Jason Pickle, who is he's really into the entrepreneur. His focus is going to be pushed towards hemp farming and legalization of marijuana. I don't want to get into that tonight. But I do want to get into something that I want as we kind of come to the close. And there is one question I want you to address that's in the weeds, but I think maybe you can help us on. But my question for you is, it seems to me that if we're going to quote unquote protect the rural way of life, that often kind of gives a connotation of get out of here. The government cannot be involved in this. But isn't it fair to say if we're gonna pull back the veil and honestly assess our realities here, is that the only way we can protect the rural way of life is by the government taking a more active role in creating justice and making sure things operate in a smooth way so that these communities can go forward. And also too, the second part is that things have to change, right? I mean, we have to embrace the reality of protecting God's creation, of addressing the changes to climate, and getting new industries that can be profitable for the future. Sorry, I'm going off a long tangent. Two questions. Does there have to be a role for government involvement? And the second question is, what do we need to do to invest in the economy of the future?
Okay. The role of government. So I I was thinking about this morning. I took a policy class in college, and I had this wonderful professor. And he had this, he drew this, like the role of government is a three-legged stool. And I woke up this morning, I could only remember two legs of the stool. And so, but I think I remembered the third. So what can policymakers do? I'm going to kind of get a little more pragmatic. I think, is there more of a role for government than we currently have? Yes. But the role of government can do three things. They can make incentives, they can make regulation, and they can, in the case of public lands or the military, they can manage. Management is the other. But let's just talk about incentive and regulation. So those are kind of the two things that policymakers actually can do if we're just talking about practical policy. And you can label incentives as big government. You could label regulation as big government if it's too much. Or maybe you have smaller amounts of those and you call it small government. When you get down to issues that we face as farmers, I feel like the important thing is to listen to the farmers, to actually look at the issues and to figure out what policies can be made that would practically solve the issues. And I think that there's a balance that has to be met. So for instance, the meat processing example is pretty good. When I first moved to Tennessee, Phil Bredesen was the governor, and Tennessee had really restrictive regulations on small farm processing of poultry. They said, USDA says you can have an exemption for a small number of chickens to process on your own farm or whatever, but the state of Tennessee said, we're not going to honor that exemption. There's no exemption in Tennessee. So that made it impossible for small producers to do anything but take their chickens at the time to Kentucky to have them processed. And so that was regulation that was really burdensome to small farm. And in the years since then, and I don't know that it was necessarily because of anything Bredesen did, or if it was the influence of Tyson at that time in Tennessee. But since then, under more conservative governors, those regulations have been rolled back some. And that has made it easier, first for poultry producers to get an exempted facility for a reasonable price, and now for small farms to actually do some on-farm processing for sale. So there is a place for deregulation to some extent. And what I like to say instead of that, because I think it's a balancing act, we don't want to be the Wild West. We don't want foodborne illness. We don't want unfair, working conditions and things like that. But we need to have regulations that are scalable, that are scale appropriate to big farms and scale appropriate to small farms. So that's the regulation side. Now on the incentive side, like government, could we use a little more government to get us, on the meat processing side to rebuild the infrastructure that we're lacking? Yes. This is a place where there's not a bunch of extra money sitting around with small farmers. There's not a bunch of extra money sitting around in processors. But if we can invest and have incentives that invest in building our capacity for more meat processing, then that's going to build our ability to have local and regional markets for meat. So yes, I feel like there is definitely a role for government to play in incentivizing that. Now, it was your second question about climate.
Sorry. The second question was about climate. I mean, so it's simply, the question is, what do we do in terms of understanding the effects of climate change, and what is the cost of not addressing that reality? What happens if we ignore it? What happens to the industry, agricultural industry? What happens to farming, particularly here in Tennessee?
Yeah. So, I certainly see the effects of climate change on my farm. It makes everything I do a little more uncertain. It means that every little bit of uncertainty that I already had to deal with is a little more uncertain. I have, there's erratic weather. It just increases uncertainty. Now, there are things that farmers are doing to, we're diversifying, we're adding, new crops that might be better able to deal. But one of the things policy-wise that we're really missing out on is the fact that agriculture and sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture, agriculture is about a lot of times growing plants, okay? And when you're growing plants, you are sequestering carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and turning it into that body of the plant. And when you can then keep that plant as organic matter in your soil, you're sequestering carbon. You're putting carbon out. You're taking carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it back in your soil. That's what regenerative agriculture is. And farmers have been doing this, for ages. There are also farms that don't do it, for sure. There are farms that focus on that. In my personal farm, and that's one of our goals, is to get more soil into the more carbon into the soil. Because when we build our soil health, we're investing in our farm. It's fertilizing. We're building our farm for the future. So farmers are like, we're at the ground level here in fighting climate change. And we want to make sure that our voices are heard in how we fight climate change, but also a lot of us feel like, you know what, we're offering a service and we should probably get paid for that service. I know that's kind of radical. And the thing is, when our elected officials deny that climate change exists, then they don't give us a seat at the table to negotiate any kind of mitigation efforts on the part of farmers. Like, agriculture is one of the biggest ways that we can sequester carbon. And so we really need a seat at the table. And so we are really interested in looking for lawmakers that we can work with, that'll help us to be part of the negotiation on that. I think you're muted.
There you go. Oh, we almost died there. What I was saying is, I hope if I do get elected to the United States Congress, I want to serve on the Ag Committee, and I'm positive that that's the one committee I want to serve on. A lot of people don't do the Ag Committee because it lost its sex appeal, to be quite honest, about 100 years ago. It's not. I don't think it's honestly very appreciated by my party, to be very blunt with you. I want to be on the Ag Committee, and I want to be a champion of farmers across this state. I need to confess two things. I'm not a farmer. I didn't grow up a farmer. But the second thing I would say is that I need the voices of farmers across this state. I'm going to be forming an agricultural committee with farmers from all 16 counties across the state of Tennessee. And I hope Jess can help me find those farmers and that we can build relationships. It's really important to me, to every farmer in Tennessee, to know that I am listening. And I understand that the government has a role to play, but it has to be a precise role. It has to be a role that understands first and foremost the particular needs of farmers across this state, and not in service to any political ideology first and foremost. So Jess, thank you for being with me tonight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for listening. I appreciate it.
Thank y'all. Folks, it was an honor to have Jess on. We're going to have plenty of farmers on as we go throughout this campaign for the United States Congress. I'm forming vocational committees, council, and the councils that I want to form first and foremost. So we're going to have an educator council, a first responder council, an ag council, and an engineering council. I want to understand the particular vocational needs across this state, and how the government can play an appropriate role, even the playing field, but also allowing industry to reemerge in the context of COVID-19. Government's not always the solution. And for me, as a millennial, as a next generation politician, I want to put to rest the old debate about, is the government too big or too small? The question isn't that, is does it work? Does it work for you and your family? Does it protect your liberties? Does it protect the equality that you were given by God in the Constitution? So I'm really honored to have Jess with me. To every farmer in Tennessee, know this: I want to be a champion for you in the United States Congress. You are the foot soldiers in this time of crisis, ensuring our families are fed. And I want to listen to you throughout this campaign, and I want to fight for you in Washington. Speaking of, we do have a campaign for the United States Congress with among us. Scott Desjardins found out he has a competitor this time, that he has competition. He's scared. I would be scared too when you have a decade of not doing anything for Tennessee families, and you have an opponent who's going to punch hard and tell that to every family in this state. You can't make up the homework in the fourth quarter. It's too late. He's already failed. The test is in, and he's failed. And now I'm going to call him on it. But I need your help. I need your help. We're going to win this election, but only if you're with me. And how can you be with me? Well, the first thing you can do tonight is go to ChristopherHale.com. That's ChristopherHale.com. Learn about my campaign, learn about who I am and what I've spent my life fighting for, who I love, where I'm from, who I've stood with, and who I'll fight for in Washington, and then sign up to be with us. You can give a contribution. Look, we are sustained by small contributions across this state. Think about this for a second. We've raised a lot of money, a good amount of money, but we got to raise a lot more. My opponent is funded by the rich and the powerful, by men in silk suits and healthcare CEOs who screw over Tennessee families. I am funded by you and those you love. The average contribution in my first month of this campaign, every check, the average contribution is $27.11. We are powered by the people of this state. I need you right now. $5 a month goes a long way. It does not feed me. It feeds this movement. It allows us to win this election and bring generational change to Tennessee and America. The best way that you can show that you're with us right now is getting a sign, a yard sign. We want to have thousands of signs crossing this state showing that you're with us and that we're with you. It's not just a sign, a political sign, but it's a sign of hope and a sign of new things to come. They're the most popular signs in Tennessee right now. If you want one, go to christopherhale.com/Hale yes. Tomorrow, I have the former chairman of the Rutherford County Democratic Party, Mr. Matt Ferry, on, and he's a state house candidate here in Rutherford County. And I'm honored to be with him. And then on Sunday, we have Trey Crowder, probably the most famous Tennessee comedian and the self-ascribed liberal redneck. We're going to talk how, in God's name, a 31-year-old Democrat can win and rule Tennessee, and he'll tell you what I'm telling you tonight. We're going to do it by punching hard. We are the party of David going against the Goliaths, but David brought a slingshot. I'm bringing a slingshot to take down Goliath, and you're going to be my slingshots too. Let's win this election. Let's make it this special state something all the more special still. Till next time, have a good night.